The desert sun beats down mercilessly on the crumbling limestone walls of what was once the most magnificent city in the ancient world. Here, buried beneath centuries of sand and silence, lies evidence of a scandal so horrific that ancient Egypt tried to erase it from history entirely. The pharaoh responsible was systematically removed from every monument, every inscription, every record that could bear witness to his crimes. His name was chiseled away with such fury that the very stones seemed to scream with the violence of their defacement. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at destruction. What we've uncovered about Akhenaten and the unspeakable acts he committed against his own daughters represents one of history's most disturbing examples of absolute power corrupting absolutely. This isn't just another tale of royal excess or political intrigue. This is the story of a man who transformed his own children into instruments of his twisted ambition, sacrificing their innocence and humanity on the altar of his megalomaniacal vision. The horror began innocently enough, as these things often do. In the golden halls of Thebes, where the Nile's life-giving waters reflected the glory of Egyptian civilization, 6 daughters were born to what appeared to be a loving royal couple. Their names rang like poetry through the palace corridors: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenamun, Neferneferuaten, Tasherit, Neferneferura, and Setepenre. Each princess carried within her name a blessing, a prayer to the gods for her prosperity and happiness. Their father, who would later become known as Akhenaten, seemed devoted to his family in those early years. Palace walls were decorated with unprecedented scenes of domestic bliss, showing the royal children playing beneath the benevolent rays of the sun god. These images were revolutionary for their time, depicting the pharaoh not as a remote divine figure, but as a loving father who delighted in his daughters' laughter and cherished their innocent games. But something dark was stirring beneath this facade of familial perfection. The young pharaoh's religious obsessions were growing more intense with each passing year. His fixation on the sun disk, the Aten, was transforming from devotion into dangerous fanaticism. He began to see himself not merely as the god's chosen representative, but as the sole conduit through which divine will could be expressed on earth. This theological megalomania would prove catastrophic for his daughters, though they could not have understood the shadow falling across their childhood paradise. While they played their innocent games and received their education in the arts befitting royal princesses, their father was laying the groundwork for a revolution that would ultimately consume their lives in ways too terrible for civilized minds to contemplate. The transformation accelerated when Akhenaten made his fateful decision to abandon Thebes entirely. He would build a new capital, a virgin city dedicated solely to his god, where he could implement his vision without interference from the traditional priesthood. This city, which he called Akhenaten, would become shocking. As construction began on the stage for horrors that even the violence-accustomed ancient world would find this desert metropolis, the royal daughters found themselves at the center of an increasingly disturbing personality cult. Their father's artists were instructed to create images that emphasized the divine nature of the royal family. But these depictions grew stranger and more unsettling as the years progressed. The princesses were shown not as individual children, but as extensions of their father's divine essence, their identities subsumed into his cosmic vision. The move to Akhenaten marked the beginning of their nightmare. Cut off from the stabilizing influence of the traditional court, isolated in a city populated entirely by their father's fanatical followers, the young princesses found themselves trapped in what amounted to a luxurious prison. The palace walls that had once seemed protective now felt suffocating, and the constant religious ceremonies that dominated daily life became an oppressive routine that allowed no escape from their father's increasingly erratic behavior. But the true horror was yet to come. As Akhenaten's his theological innovations grew desperate, the the traditional sources Saturn's religious revolution reached its peak. His need to legitime of royal authority had been severed when he rejected the ancient gods. The priesthood that had validated pharaonic power for millennia had been dismissed and scattered. Foreign allies were beginning to question Egypt's stability under this radical ruler. In this crisis of legitimacy, Akhenaten turned to the most disturbing solution imaginable. He would use his own daughters to create a new form of divine kingship, one that concentrated sacred power within his immediate family through means that violated every norm of human decency. What he planned for these innocent young women represented a perversion of both paternal love and royal authority that staggers the imagination. The first signs of what was to come appeared in subtle changes to palace protocol. The eldest daughter, Akhenaten, began appearing in ceremonies typically reserved for the queen. At first, this seemed merely ceremonial, perhaps a way to honor a beloved daughter or prepare her for future marriage to a suitable prince. But as months passed, the nature of her elevated status became increasingly clear and increasingly disturbing. Palace artists were commissioned to create reliefs showing Akhenaten in positions that left no doubt about her new role. She stood beside her father during religious ceremonies, not as a daughter supporting her parent, but as a wife supporting her husband. The iconography was unmistakable to anyone familiar with Egyptian royal symbolism. This young woman, barely into her teens, was being prepared for a fate that would have horrified even the most jaded courtiers of that decadent age. The psychological manipulation required to accomplish this transformation must have been extraordinary. Akhenaten had spent years conditioning his daughters to see him as more than merely their father. In his theological system, he was the earthly embodiment of divine will, the living representative of the sun god whose word was literally sacred law. To disobey him was not merely rebellion against paternal authority, but blasphemy against the cosmic order itself. This religious conditioning provided the framework for what would follow, but it could not entirely mask the fundamental wrongness of what Akhenaten was planning. The palace servants whispered in horror about the ceremonies they were forced to witness. Foreign diplomats sent increasingly disturbed reports back to their home courts. Even the fanatical followers, who had abandoned everything to follow their pharaoh to his desert capital, began to express private doubts about the direction of his religious revolution. Meanwhile, the other princesses watched in growing terror as their eldest sister's fate became clear. They could see their own futures written in Akhenaten's glazed eyes and mechanical smiles. The loving father who had once delighted in their childhood games had become something monstrous, a creature whose need for theological validation had consumed any remnant of natural human feeling. The tragedy deepened when Queen Nefertiti, the girl's mother and the one person who might have protected them, mysteriously disappeared from the historical record. Whether she died, was exiled, or simply retreated into obscurity to escape the horror of what her husband had become, her absence left the princesses completely vulnerable to their father's increasingly deranged schemes. As Akhenaten's formal elevation to queenship approached, the psychological damage inflicted on the royal family became impossible to hide. Palace physicians were called in to treat various members of the household for what ancient records describe as ailments of the mind and spirit. The youngest princesses, some barely past infancy, began showing signs of severe emotional disturbance that would mark them for the remainder of their tragically short lives. The preparations for the ceremony that would formalize Akhenaten's new status proceeded with all the pomp and grandeur that Akhenaten could muster. Golden ornaments were crafted, precious stones were set into ceremonial regalia, and the finest artists in the kingdom were commissioned to create monuments celebrating this unholy union. But beneath the surface, magnificence lay a rot so profound that it would ultimately destroy not just the individuals involved, but the entire dynasty they represented. The ceremony that would formalize this abomination took place on a day when the desert winds carried whispers of unease throughout the capital. Ancient texts describe preparations that lasted for weeks, with craftsmen working around the clock to create the regalia that would mark Meritaten's transformation from daughter to wife. The irony was not lost on those forced to participate in these preparations. They were creating symbols of sacred marriage for a union that represented the complete corruption of everything those symbols had once meant. The psychological terror inflicted on Meritaten during this period defies comprehension. Imagine being barely 15 years old, having grown up believing your father loved you as any parent should love their child, only to discover that his affection had twisted into something unspeakably dark. The young woman who had once danced freely in palace gardens now moved through the corridors like a ghost, her eyes vacant, her spirit already broken by the weight of what was expected of her. But Akhenaten's perversions did not end with his eldest daughter. As the months passed and it became clear that Meritaten had not immediately produced the male heir he desperately needed, the pharaoh's attention turned to his second daughter, Akhenaten. This young girl, who could not have been more than 13, suddenly found herself thrust into the same nightmare that had consumed her sister. The pattern established with Meritaten repeated itself with horrifying precision. Palace artists were again commissioned to create reliefs showing the new arrangement, their hands trembling as they carved images that violated every principle of decent human behavior. Akhenaten began appearing in ceremonies wearing the regalia of queenship, standing beside her father in poses that made their new relationship unmistakably clear to anyone who witnessed these obscene spectacles. The psychological manipulation required to accomplish these successive transformations reveals the depths of Akhenaten's depravity. He had created an environment where his daughters had no choice but to comply with his demands, where resistance unthinkable. The religious was not merely forbidden, but literally framework he had constructed made questioning his will equivalent to questioning divine authority itself. Contemporary accounts from palace servants, preserved in fragments of papyrus that survived the later attempts at destruction, describe scenes that haunt the imagination. They speak of young women who move through their daily routines like sleepwalkers, their personalities fractured by trauma too severe for their minds to process. They describe ceremonies where these broken girls performed their roles as queens with mechanical precision, while their eyes stared into some distant horror that only they could see. The medical consequences of these arrangements soon became apparent in ways that would shock even an age accustomed to the brutalities of absolute power. Palace physicians were summoned repeatedly to treat conditions that the surviving medical papyri describe in euphemistic language, but their meaning is clear enough to modern understanding. These young women were suffering physical trauma that reflected the unnatural nature of their relationships with their father. The tragedy reached its most horrific crescendo when Akhenaten died under circumstances that the court desperately tried to conceal. The official records speak vaguely of illness, but the artistic evidence tells a different story. Reliefs carved in the royal tomb show scenes of mourning around a young woman lying on what appears to be a birthing bed, attended by midwives and accompanied by a wet nurse holding a newborn infant. The implications of this imagery are inescapable and devastating.